Our next speaker is going to focus on Earth systems modeling, and if we could get the microphone.
Yep.
Thank you. She is Dr. Gretchen Miller. She's an associate professor of water resources engineering, and she's in the Department of Civil Engineering at Texas A&M. Her background is geological engineering and environmental engineering. She specializes in eco-hydrology and groundwater sustainability, investigating interactions between groundwater, soil moisture, and vegetation, and their implications for managing water resources. She studies groundwater-dependent ecosystems and develops models of plant and water relations in the tropics, methods of artificial recharge for groundwater, such as aquifer storage and recovery systems. She has several awards from Texas A&M. Dr. Miller, Gretchen?
Thank you very much for having me today. It really is an honor to be able to speak in front of you all, especially at this stage of my career. Today I want to talk, I guess maybe optimism is for the young, so a little bit uplifting. I want to talk about the role of Earth system modeling in sustainable groundwater management. And whenever we make a model, my professors told me that we need to have a reason to make the model. So I first want to tell you about the reason why we need to start making these much more complex models. Although simple models are fantastic in that they can tell us things quickly, we need very complex models able to test future scenarios and give us more details on the things we need to know. Okay, so nobody has defined groundwater sustainability yet in quite this fashion. This is the American Society of Civil Engineers definition of groundwater sustainability. And I want to bring it up because I sure argued over it a lot, particularly with regards to entropy and the laws of thermodynamics and sustainability. But what I really want to draw your attention towards is that we're looking at sustainability in the context of contributing to the objectives of society now and in the future. And ASCE, EWRI says that this is hydrological, environmental, and ecological integrity, okay? And I want to talk a little bit about the ecological integrity of these systems, which we haven't discussed much today except as a few side notes. So when we think about sustainable management of groundwater, we tend to think of the most obvious impacts on people and society, particularly irrigated agriculture. And I'm not saying that that isn't probably the most important thing we want to look at, but we do want to discuss the planet side and how the groundwater depletion problems can affect natural systems. Okay, so groundwater dependent ecosystems, we've heard a little bit about these so far, primarily in the form of pharatophytes. Pharatophytes being either deeply rooted or riparian vegetation that rely on the subsurface presence of groundwater. These are plants that take their root systems and move water to the surface, evapotranspire it into the atmosphere, act as a sink of groundwater. We also have some processes that go on with these particularly woody species, very deep-rooted woody species. If you think of an oak taproot, can go up to 10 meters is the usual level that we say is not quite the limit, but the normal. The limit is somewhere around 50 meters of rooting systems, which is just tremendous. Think about the amount of carbon and the amount of biomass a tree has to put in to get a rooting system down that deep. But what these trees can do is move water from the groundwater and store it in the soil through a process known as hydraulic lift. And so this process is actually pretty important for the vegetation around it, particularly these, the grasses, the seasonal grasses that rely on just soil moisture. We can also have islands of fertility that develop around springs and other geological features where water is coming out. This is an example of a perched perched water table with a spring. And then, of course, what we talked about earlier was the gaining streams. So groundwater, where the groundwater table intersects and makes up base flow in the stream. Most of the aquatic ecosystems we think about rely on this base flow. The dry stream frequency that was shown earlier is an example of how base flow was removed. And so what happens to the fish and even in some cases the beavers, nature's engineers, making their dams along the river. And then in meadows and plains also benefit from a high water table. So one of the big questions that we have with these that we haven't really answered yet is, are they obligate or facultative? So do these ecosystems, and this is the big division between the two, do they rely on the presence of this groundwater, or does this simply make them healthier? Can they have higher leaf area index, higher biomass, or will they die out completely if the groundwater table is removed? That's a what-if question we don't really want to answer, right? Without models, at least. We don't want to make this experiment very frequent, although we have started to. Let's see. Okay, so groundwater-dependent ecosystems really can span a range of environments. This one is one I've been studying for, I guess, about 10 years now. The oak savannas in California, so these ring the Central Valley we've been discussing. This is a new one that I've started studying recently. This is a cenote in the Yucatan Peninsula. This is one of the main natural tourist attractions in Cancun, besides the beaches. These are under stress because of groundwater extraction for tourism and non-sustainable development of tourism. This is an endangered salamander that lives in San Marcos Springs in Texas. So this is associated with the Edwards Aquifer. And then, of course, I do want to mention center pivots in deserts as another groundwater-dependent ecosystem. We don't think of this as, or certainly not a natural ecosystem, but back to the irrigated agriculture and its dependence on groundwater. So the big questions here are how much and when. So how much water do these ecosystems require, and when do they require it? So we can talk in annual terms of this is how much water they use per year. But what we find is that particularly in systems like this, which is a Mediterranean climate, when we have differences in precipitation incoming, we see that these sorts of vegetation only rely on groundwater for a portion of their growing season. And if it's extracted at the wrong time, or if the water table is lowered at the wrong time, it can be very problematic. But that gives us an advantage because we can think of ways that we might be able to smartly extract water or smartly handle the water that we don't damage these ecosystems. Same idea with fish. We have to be careful we're not lowering base flow levels during spawning periods, for instance. Okay, so I want to make the argument that this is really an interdisciplinary challenge. We have a number of questions we need to address, a number of data needs, and sets of tools. So for instance, with the data needs, we need to do a better job of, or not a better, a more comprehensive job of quantifying groundwater. Kansas is an excellent example of how that can be done, but there aren't those sorts of resources to quantify throughout the country. Characterization of ecosystem function and distribution and water requirements. I think this is probably the biggest data gap that we have. And then pumping and recharge rates. The point was made earlier, we frequently don't know exactly how much water we're pumping from the subsurface for a variety of reasons. Maybe landowners don't want to share that information in some states, don't compel them to. So appropriate tools for this. Groundwater modeling has primarily been limited to models of the saturated subsurface. But I want to discuss how Earth system models can fit into this, how remote sensing can fit into this. I think we've talked about that today too, and how observation networks, ones you might not be familiar with, like Ameriflux and the LTER networks and the critical zone observatories. So this is long-term ecosystem research, critical zone observatory. These are all Earth system monitoring facilities. So they monitor not just the groundwater table, but everything that comes up through the column. Groundwater table, soil moisture, vegetation health, and precipitation. And then finally, what sort of management options do we have for this? In-stream flow requirements are sort of the baseline, but these have been in primarily the surface water community. But these are what water flows do we need for aquatic health. They're usually related to dam releases. I think we can relate them to groundwater. Wetland mitigation banking, so helping to preserve some of these groundwater-fed wetlands. Managed aquifer recharge, we talked about that. And then ecosystem services valuation. So really figuring out how much money we're losing when we damage these sorts of ecosystems. Okay, so a number of things, a number of recent advances have gone towards the question of where are these systems. Australia has really led this effort, particularly in southern Australia. I think this comes out of their massive drought. This Murray-Darling Basin here has been, I think, one of the primary places where investigation of GDs has gone on. But you can see they're mapping, and they have the coverage for all of Australia. GDEs reliant on subsurface groundwater, so that's deep-rooted vegetation, and those are in the red and orange colors, and GDEs reliant on surface expression of groundwater in the green colors. And I think this really states powerfully, how much of this watershed is covered in these GDEs. This is some work that my student and I did in the Edwards Aquifer. This is the home of that salamander I showed. And it really demonstrates, this is from remote sensing, this is MODIS and Landsat combination, for those of you who know about the satellites. But this was some mapping efforts that we made to say, okay, where are these ecosystems in an area we know that should have them? And so we found the three types. We found the upland pharatophytes in this area. We found the riparian wetlands in this area. And we found spring-based GDEs in this area. Notice where we're near San Antonio and Austin, the major stressors on this aquifer. We took this then and did our back-of-the-envelope calculation, and we found that GDEs really are important. If we assume that all of these take up groundwater at a modest rate, so 0.5 millimeter a day, averaged over the year, that's kind of a crude estimation, but not entirely unreasonable from some of the estimates we've seen. And we multiply that by the area that we found in this mapping. We see that we have somewhere on the order of 150 MGD, 150 million gallons a day of usage by vegetation. So that's water being transpired into the atmosphere. We can compare this to the permits for the Edwards Aquifer, just to give an idea of the scale, which is around the order of 200 for San Antonio and 510 for the whole aquifer. So these are a substantial, under-investigated contributor to water extraction in this particular aquifer. Okay, so now on to Earth system modeling. So the Earth system is this idea that we're looking at multiple spheres of, I guess multiple spheres of science might be the best way to put it. We're integrating hydrology, geology, ecology, and climatology all together to look at particular effects of climate change and other engineering anthropogenic decisions. So this comes primarily out of the climate modeling community, and they've been sort of working their way down in the world, and now they've decided on groundwater as the next thing. So the models currently do a really poor job of integrating groundwater, and as we know, current groundwater models tend to do a poor job of integrating surface processes. So the idea here is to combine them, and now that we really do have the computer processing power that was discussed, now that we really do have that, we are looking at running these much more complex models. So for instance, in the example I have here, the data that goes in here are political and watershed boundaries, climate, infrastructure, land cover, soils, topography. Hydrology is strangely not on here. Aquifers are not either. Again, like I said, this comes out of the climate modeling community, so a lot of this, they're just now getting to us. We put this into the computational framework, and we show here as a control volume that is one grid cell. Sometimes in these models the grid cells interact, sometimes they don't. But what we're interested in these models is the greenhouse gas emissions, effects on hydroelectric production, agriculture production, floods and droughts, and soil moisture. So these models are really the only way that we're ever going to be able to really get at in a holistic way what's going to happen to groundwater reserves and what's going to happen to groundwater-dependent ecosystems under a changing climate regime. The reason for this is that the models are able to take atmospheric data either in combination with a global climate model or as just a forcing from a weather station, and say, okay, we have this radiation regime, this wind regime, and this precipitation regime. Our land surface model then says, okay, here's what's going on in the vegetation. It passes this down to the subsurface in the form of soil evaporation, plant transpiration, and infiltration, or recharge. Then it passes up a set of key hydrologic responses back to the land surface model. So this is in a very coupled fashion, where we're saying, okay, what's soil moisture and groundwater discharge? And then we pass that back as an effect on evapotranspiration, transpiration, sensible heat loss. So everything at the surface here that controls how the climate responds to water fluxes. Okay? Without this type of modeling, we can't hope to answer the question of what happens to these systems because we don't have a dynamic feedback. And the feedbacks here are one of the most important things. So to give you a couple examples, this is, again, my study in the oak savannas in California. And they're very interesting because they have a net radiation regime that is very much out of sync with the precipitation regime. So they want to grow and transpire, or they want to grow and assimilate carbon, so photosynthesize, when net radiation is the highest. However, that's when precipitation is the lowest. So they use a strategy. Well, I don't want to anthropomorphize them. They are trees, after all. But they have evolved a strategy to take up groundwater during the summer and even help water infiltrate during the winter when it's there in excess. So groundwater acts as a storage bank for this vegetation. So we can look at one of these Earth system models for just this little region and determine where water is coming from throughout different portions of the year. And remember I said they're storing, our groundwater is being stored and they're using that during the summer. So here's the dry summer period. You see the soil moisture being depleted as the trees are transpiring, and then we go to almost entirely groundwater use during the end of the growing season. The primary carbon fixation occurs during this period, but without this water, we think trees would go into a carbon starvation period. Using the Earth system modeling approach, we can then test, okay, what happens if we get big changes in the groundwater table? So what happens, each of these colors is a different groundwater level, and you see that groundwater uptake doesn't change all that terribly much based on different groundwater levels. But what does change is transpiration during that late summer period, soil water potential, right? and leaf water potential, which is the main measure of plant stress. So you see, as the water table decreases, we get much higher leaf water potential, much higher plant stress, much lower evapotranspiration, until we reach a point where perhaps our ecosystem is no longer functioning. One thing I want to comment about this is that we've gotten, well, we know that there are some big assumptions in this that we have to make because we just don't have the data. So one of the questions you might ask is, well, how fast can the roots catch up with the water table decline? We don't really know. One, we have a hard time studying roots because of their highly destructible nature, right? Digging a hole does not work so well. And two, we just don't have the technology to figure out where they are. Maybe with some of the new geophysics developing, we'll be able to get there, though. The second one I want to talk about is climate change in the Yucatan Peninsula, again, where we have Cancun and our beautiful cenotes here. These are roots down into the water. I love this picture because people always like, how could roots go down that far? Well, here they are. You can see them. The Yucatan Peninsula, being surrounded by the Gulf here and the Caribbean, has what we call the perched groundwater lands. And areas in the Middle East and several other portions of the world have very similar systems. So what happens is, as you extract water here for Cancun or here for Merida, you start changing the saltwater groundwater interface. Now, the really complicated portion of this is that as climate change goes on, we're going to change the recharge in the middle. So here we have recharge. We're going to change the recharge in the middle, and how this changes is going to affect where the brackish water interface goes and whether or not the town Merida here, or the city of Merida here, can get fresh, or still has fresh water available in their wells. So looking at the recharge predictions, these are not from an Earth system model. These are from some more coarse estimates. Our next step of this is actually putting it in an Earth system model. But you see recharge goes something on the order of 400 millimeters per year currently to a projected 106 millimeters per year by the end of the century. And so what we want to know is, how is this really going to impact the water resources? I think our takeaway is going to be go to Cancun now. Just one more mention of the couplings. I said there were 3 couplings here that were important. There's actually 4. One of the emerging areas in this field is reactive transport modeling. So instead of just coupling our water systems, now we couple the chemistry systems, which is very important for our water or for nutrients that come up, particularly nitrogen and nitrogen fixation. Then just to sum up, this is not my figure, but I really liked it. This came out recently in a remote sensing journal, Huntington. And it's NDVI, which is a measure of greenness, and water table depth. And in this graph, you can see that the two are somewhat related, but then we have these anomalies, right? I want to make this point that it's important to look at this in really holistic content, because what we have going on is that each of these years has different incoming precipitation. So as groundwater declines, we don't always get a decline in vegetation health. But we do see an overall before pumping and after pumping. This is in Nevada, by the way, in Snake Valley. Before pumping and after pumping, overall vegetation health goes down, particularly in drier years. And ET potential stays about the same. And so this is one way we need to be able to pick out what the drivers actually are of our changes. How much, and this is, I think, one of the big challenges, is how much of our changes are due to climate change, how much are due to pumping, and how much is due to natural variability. And trying to segregate them out is nearly impossible when we don't have models that can look at theoretical scenarios or help us assimilate that data. So really just in summary, the new unknowns, depth to first groundwater. So our very shallow aquifer tables, sometimes, our shallow water tables sometimes are ignored if they're not considered aquifers. So sometimes we don't know or don't have a good handle on the depth of first groundwater because that's not the productive groundwater we're interested in. And then root structure and function, I think, is probably one of the biggest unknowns here. Finally, the feedbacks is really what I want to emphasize, that we have very strong feedbacks between systems like groundwater and surface water, groundwater in the atmosphere, and groundwater in the biosphere that we're only really now understanding. And in the future, knowing how those things interoperate is going to be very important for any kind of the engineering or technological solutions that we might put to this problem. Okay, so just acknowledgments to my students and my funders. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. We're a little bit behind, but I think we have some time for a question or two. Yes.
Sophomore Sherry, University of Maryland. So I appreciate that you mentioned all these strong feedbacks between the groundwater system and the ecological systems. How about the feedbacks between the groundwater system and the demographic and economic system, the human system?
Also tremendous and not able to be ignored. However, we don't have good, I personally don't have the interdisciplinary knowledge to span that gulf, right? It's going to take bringing in economists, bringing in policymakers in order to really understand how humans will react to these changing systems. And I agree, it is a layer of complexity that we have barely tapped. These models can only really look at the physics and have only been really structured to look at the physics. We're just now getting the physics rightish. But I think that's absolutely going to be one of the most important factors here, because we can say, okay, if we lower the groundwater this much, we'll have this sort of impact. But we can't say, well, is that impact enough to drive change in our behavior? And that's where the ecosystem services valuation comes in, like how much money would we have to spend to replace these ecosystem services that we're damaging? But it's very much an open arena.
I think there was one other person here who wanted to ask a question. Starvis? I'm seeing here.
Dr. Miller, I think there was a National Academy of Science report on Edwards Aquifer, which was aimed at ecological issues, right? And I think there's a second report coming out or something now.
I didn't know there was
Not
a new one
familiar.
coming out, but yes, I've seen the old, the previous one. Yeah, the Edwards Aquifer is really a interesting hotspot for the intersection of all of these issues because it has two of the big cities in Texas in it. Houston has its own problems, but San Antonio and Austin are rather water stressed. And it has some of the most, or it has a lot of endangered species in the area, and those two interests can very much collide. I think so far, and Bridget might disagree, but so far, some of the solutions that have come about are pretty positive. Like San Antonio is doing, because of the change, or because of their water allocation changes, they're doing aquifer storage and recovery. I think that's been a net positive for the area. There's been actions taken like protecting the recharge zone. And so I think there is some hope in areas where we can make an impact through knowing more, about how these processes interact.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you. I'd like to.